Welcome to Michigan Reimagined, presented by T.A. Forsberg and Wagoner Financial. And here's your host, Chris Buck.
So housing, the lack of volume, and affordability has been a topic of discussion throughout Michigan and on this show in particular. Solutions require a wide variety of stakeholders, and here to share the story of TriTerra and the process of environmental due diligence is their Director of Multifamily Housing, Mr. Shawn Shadley. Welcome to the show, Shawn.
Hey, thank you, Chris. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so for those non-scientists, what services does TriTerra provide to its client, kind of overall?
Sure. Yeah, I like to think we can bring a project from A to Z. So, the due diligence, that's the phase ones, the environmental site assessments. That's really the catalyst for a lot of our service lines. That's what people are usually looking for on transactional work. So when they want to buy a piece of property, a commercial piece of property, that's usually the starting block. And as we move through the process, that might feed some of our other service lines. Not that they don't do their own standalone stuff, but we have, phase two environmental site assessments, which is, if we have concerns with the phase one, it leads into some additional soil or groundwater testing.
Yep. We
have industrial hygiene services. That's your lead-based paint, asbestos, those kind of service lines. We have brownfield development. So, we like to bring some money to the table where we can. So we look for grants, loans, other opportunities to bring money to the table to help stack that cash for the developer. Beyond that, we have our natural resources department. They provide, look at, we like to call them, the birds and bees kind of things, but floodplain evaluations, wetland surveys, those type of service lines. And then kind of an add-on to the phase two type stuff is we do a lot. We have our, as we like to call it, our vapor mitigation group. So as we'll talk more today, a lot of times we have to mitigate exposures, and that group installs these systems to make sure that, the space is healthy.
Got it. Okay. So that's a wide variety of services that you provide.
It really
is.
is.
Phenomenal. Okay. And how long has TriTerra been in this business?
Yeah, I believe this is our 16th year in business. Don McNabb and a former partner started the business that long ago, and we've just exploded.
And what kind of territory does TriTerra serve? Is it? I mean, we're recording this in mid-Michigan, but I understand you're a Grand Rapids guy. So
that's correct.
What's the footprint for TriTerra?
Yeah, so Lansing's headquarter. We also are located in Grand Rapids. We have an office in Elma. We have some standalone folks in Traverse City as well as Kalamazoo. And we just hired, and our next push is into the Detroit market. So that's our next target for growth for the company.
And it seems like that need is omnipresent. I mean, to assess transactional land needs to happen everywhere transactions happen, right? So,
absolutely. Anywhere in the U.S.
Right on. Okay. And so who are your clients? Who tends to call you and say, hey, I need to deploy your services?
Yeah, I mean, it's a wide variety. For me personally, I have a lot of developers, of course, attorneys. I do a lot with lenders. It may be a situation where maybe they're financing a deal, want to assess the risk for the bank, or in some places, and hopefully we don't get to this point like 2008, but you've got the workout stuff where they might be foreclosing on properties. Brokers are another great source of opportunity for us as well as municipal, clients. So, I mean, it's really the broad, there's a broad brush that, that we paint with.
Right. So now your role is Director of Multifamily Housing. So what is your background? What experiences do you have? Credentials? Like, what does it take to do the role that you're in?
Yeah. So I've been in this industry for 21 years. I've kind of I started looking in cell towers. That was really big in the early 2000s. So that's where I got a lot of my, boots on the ground experience. As I transitioned away from that industry, I kind of fell into affordable housing, and it was something I was very passionate about. I enjoy the opportunity to, take, something, either it be, a piece of land that we're going to build something that's affordable for people to live in, or quite frankly, sometimes there's adaptive reuse, this old industrial building that really has no function anymore. And now we're making a place, safe place for people to live.
Right. And the safety thing is really what you're all about.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And I want to give a tip of the cap to one of our sponsors, the Wagner Financial folks. Are you ready to make smart financial decisions? Wagner Financial offers a proven process for financial transformation, empowering individuals of all stages, whether you're just starting out, nearing retirement, or anywhere in between. Stop feeling unsure about your financial path. Wagner Financial can help you undergo a financial transformation. Schedule a consultation today to discuss your individual needs and discover how Wagner Financial can guide you by visiting wagner-financial.com or call them at 517-853-3367. So is work, is it a busy time right now? We're recording this in December of 2024, but like on the pendulum, right? I mean, do you have busy times and slower times, whether it's economic cycles or times of the year? Like, talk to me about your funnel.
I mean, ideally, we want to keep, that ramp up. But I would say there's always an ebb and flow in our industry. And this time of year does slow down a little bit. You've got holidays, end of year, and especially this year, although with, Trump coming in office and not trying to make this political, sometimes there's uncertainty in election years on what to expect. But I think we all have a pretty good understanding of, what policy is going to look like. It'd probably look very similar to what, he had before. But no, I would say generally we've been, growing like crazy. We've just were awarded again Inc. 5000, like one of the fastest growing firms for our third year in a row. So we're doing things right.
That's great. And so when you're deployed to in your particular realm, right? So you're the director of multifamily housing. So these are developers who are proposing to either retrofit an old building, like you mentioned, an industrial building, or take a green space, or maybe, like you said, a brownfield, and turn it into multifamily housing. You get deployed to go out and confirm that the space that's going to be built is environmentally safe.
Correct.
In a nutshell, right? So, I mean, and then you mentioned grants and loans and ways for people to remediate, because I guess, what percentage of the time do you come back with a clean bill of health, and what percentage of the time do you come back and say there's a problem that needs to be mitigated? It's not a deal breaker per se, or maybe how often do you have deal breaking problems? It seems like anything can be mitigated. It's just a matter of whether you can afford to do it.
Correct. Yeah. So, I think we kind of follow these stats. I think for us, about 50% of the time we have some concerns, potential contamination. There's always other concerns we can, get off on that tangent. But from a standpoint, is a contaminator or not, that's probably, 50% of the time we establish there's the potential, right? And that's when we would step into the phase 2 sampling, which is the soil or groundwater testing.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it varies. Like you said, I would say it's probably more apt in your urban areas. Yep. Right, because there's former buildings, things that may have existed previously on that vacant piece of land. If you're out in a rural area, people are developing and we need housing everywhere. So,
right.
out in the sticks, as people like to call it, you still need housing. And those are certainly less likely to show concerns.
Right. But even when you find, contamination, I think maybe a listener who's not in this ecosystem might think that that's, obviously it is a bad thing, but there's a lot of folks that are motivated on cleaning up the dirty, right? So it's not that developers are coming in and saying there's contamination on this land, so we're going to move on and go find another place to build this. There's a lot of incentive for builders to get these places cleaned up so that environmental, for I guess 2 reasons from just my layperson's observations, is one, we want the environment to be clean, right? So if we know that this parcel of land is dirty, let's make it not dirty anymore. And then there's also kind of the preventing the sprawl, right? Having adaptive reuse or second uses, the idea of brownfields, meaning that you're taking a space that was once used for this use, and now we're going to use it again, as opposed to leaving this empty and blighted and go out and turn a farmer's field into an apartment complex, right? To kind of just modern principles, right? So what kinds of tools are there out there to help developers, who do discover? You mentioned brownfield. I don't think people really fully understand what a brownfield is, but there are probably other grants, and you mentioned other things. But a developer finds this parcel of land. They have the business plan to turn it into multifamily housing, and they run into the stumbling block of, used to be a mechanic's shop, and there's buried, fuel tanks or whatever those problems might be. How do they pay for those the bill? Who pays for it? How does that work?
Yeah. So, the loaded question, but we'll start with, let's say we identify contamination. It's somewhat of a misnomer that, oh my gosh, it's contaminated, run for the hills, right? When we look at a property, we're looking at what, we're evaluating that exposure risk. Yeah, the property might be contaminated, but the next step is what's the potential concern to that occupant? So we typically will look at, 3 main exposure pathways. Inhalation, so is the contamination bad enough to inhale? Okay. Ingestion, is it bad enough to, like drinking water? If it's on a water well, is that going to impact the individuals or, people living in those buildings? And then direct contact. So is the soil really contaminated where if you touch it, it could create an exposure hazard as well? So I just like to bring that up because a lot of people, and I see it every day, it's not only like the first step is like, well, I'm only doing this because my attorney or the bank is making me do this. And I try to educate people on that, it's important you do a phase 1 because the law is strict joint and several. So basically it doesn't matter what you've done, just the fact that you're associated with that property. Down the road, if there's a cleanup, you can be a liable party. So it's so important that you do the phase 1 prior to closing on that property. I like to call it a cheap insurance policy.
Got it. So don't own it yet.
Correct. Yes.
That's
do
what
your
due
assessment
diligence means.
work.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So let's say we've gotten past that part. We've identified that. It comes down to timing too on things, right? Going back to brownfields and things like that. There's certain tools in the toolbox. Tax increment financing. There's grant and loan programs through Eagle. Some things even on the local level to help pay for those costs. But I would say you've got to be prepared. You've got to have pro formas together. I mean, it's a lengthy process. It's usually at least 6 months to find and get an approval from council or whatever.
Right.
That, hey, we're willing to kick in and help with this development.
Got it. Okay. So then you as TriTerra, you get called in to do these assessments. What is your deliverable? What do you provide to the people who've inquired for you to do this work?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not a brand new car. It's a report, Okay. So, and typically that's important as well because again, there's going to be a bank. There's going to be, someone maybe at the local level. People need to see this report, right? Unless you've got, deep pockets and you're just bringing cash to the table. But again, that's an insurance policy, so you hold on to that, right? You never know down the road when you go to sell the property. Things like that. I mean, this is a process that, phase 1's good for 6 months, after which time you can update it within a year, but then you've got to start the process all over. So having these things to share with, potential future purchasers, right?
Right.
Is important to have. But yeah, I would say that's mostly, it's just a report and, everyone barely reads it, but if they do, it's usually just the executive summary and they're still asking me, what does this mean?
Right. Okay. Now, do you get landowners or real estate brokers who proactively get a phase 1 just so that step is kind of done? I'm just thinking about, whether it's, any listing, right? So whether there is an empty building on a plot of land or whether it's a vacant, parcel. And if I'm a real estate broker representing the landowner who says, I want to sell this asset, and the broker is like, okay, the first question that might be asked is, is this shovel ready? Can I build what I want to build on there? Mm-hmm. Do people get proactive and just say, I think you should pay for a phase 1? That way, when I get inquiries as the broker representing the land, can say, and this is, we've done one of those 6 month long, the study ahead of time to make that process faster.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly happens. As a consultant, I've got to preface, I'm not an attorney, but I do not recommend that a current landowner take and do that due diligence. And the reason I say that is kind of like what I was talking about earlier. The phase 1, if you do it, prior to your purchase, and that is under the innocent landowner defense, that's your defense for not being liable. So as soon as you do work on a property and you haven't done that before, let's say you we're ignorant and you just bought the property. Now you've opened Pandora's box, and now you
Now it's known.
Now it's known, and you can't hide, stick your head in the sand, so to speak.
Right,
I'm not trying to be immoral, but
sure.
But quite honestly, you've got to think about that, and what you're opening up is potential liability.
Sure.
When you do that.
So I think, I'm role playing in my mind a question of a property that I already know about, but there was a corner lot. Legacy business had been there forever. Business is going to shutter, and the owner is going to retire and sell the land basically as his retirement. And turns out, before his 30-year run on that property, it had been a gas station. And so now he's trying to sell it 30 years after. His business had nothing to do with the cause of that contamination. But when he's trying to sell this business, they bring in people like TriTerra and kind of do their due diligence before the new people are going to buy this property and use it for a completely different use. And they find buried gas tanks that were just left there from when the gas station went under. So is the person that ran the business there for 30 years liable? Maybe, how does that... Is that where the brownfield and other ways, or can you go back to the people who ran that gas station that went out of business in 1974 and hold them accountable? And what were the laws back then? And were they in compliance at the time?
That's a great question.
I mean, how does that all get unpacked?
Yeah. So again, kind of going back to what I talked about earlier, environmental law, anybody that's been connected to that property anytime, regardless if they contributed to that contamination, is a potential liable party. So with that being said, do your due diligence, do your phase one, protect yourself. For a few $1,000s, you can sleep at night. A lot of times in those kind of situations, there's other, there's funding available. So Eagle has the MUSTA program, where if we find tanks, and there's going to be some changes coming up in the new year, but let's assume they had gasoline in them. We can, in their orphan tanks, nobody knew about them, et cetera, right? I mean, we can register those tanks and help pay for some of those costs for assessing the tanks, maybe getting rid of some of the soils. Usually it's very difficult to cover the costs for the tank removal.
Right.
And I'll be honest, in every negotiation, every land deal, and this is why, again, it's so important we do as much of this work before closing. I know you're looking more at the seller side, but as the buyer, this gives us a ton of leverage, right? Like, hey, we need a concession on the sales price because we know we've got these tanks we're going to remove. It's going to be another $10,000 or whatever that number is, right?
Right.
Again, it just gives you more leverage to and maybe you still run away, right? Maybe you're like, you know what, I don't want to deal with this. But it also brings in other tools like we talked about, some of the tax increment financing tools, other things like that. And again, it kind of depends on what you're doing with the property. If it's going to kind of be the same, there's probably not a lot of money out there, right? But if you're going to knock down this building and build a 5-story multi-use building, it may be advantageous to go down that road and look at tax increment finance or some other of the tools in the toolbox.
Right. Maybe a little bit of a sidebar, but when I was looking at your bio, I saw that you talked pretty passionately about your ensuring compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. I'm assuming NEPA.
NEPA, but yeah,
NEPA.
That's fine.
Okay. So who are they? And because now so that's a national, federal
Correct.
standard, as opposed to having potentially state laws and county laws and city laws and all those kinds of things. So what is their stance, and why is that important to you?
Yeah, so NEPA stands for the National Environmental Policy Act. It was established in 1970, and the purpose of it was anytime that you have funding or even licensing, so FCC, for example, right, through the federal government, you have to look at this policy act and you have to take the steps. So it can be something very simple. It could be an EA, or it could be the worst case, which is an environmental impact statement. So, part of this was, go back to like the 50s, 60s, and even predate that. There wasn't a lot of oversight. Like, we're going to put this, highway through either maybe a very low-come-in area or maybe a very, mature, very nice wetland area, like very valuable. We didn't look at what is the long-term impacts on these things. So that's why they established the policy. So basically, like I said, any government agency, if you're getting funding or licensing through them, you have to look at this. I run into this a lot on my affordable housing stuff because, we're getting financing through the state, like the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, or potentially HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, other agencies as well. So the NEPA is really a different way of looking at environmental impact. So we're more concerned with, what impacts is this going to have on wetlands and floodplains and air quality and all of these items. And then there's also the part, what about socioeconomically? Is this, if you're putting 1,000 units of housing in Leslie, Michigan, what impact's that going to have, on stormwater, water, sewer?
Right.
So it's a different view than our traditional environmental, like the phase ones and stuff. But again, anytime there's federal involvement in a deal, we have to look at it. And it's like most things, it adds more time because we have more hurdles.
Right on. Okay. Here at Michigan Reimagine, we tell stories of passionate Michiganders doing great things across the state. Today's podcast sponsor takes the art of positive storytelling to a whole new level. The good people at Good Marketing work with organizations across the state that are having a positive impact on the lives of Michigan residents. They help educate communities on the importance of affordable housing, the impact of wildlife and natural resource management, the availability of workforce development and education programs. If it lifts people up and makes communities stronger, then they want to help tell and spread the word. If your organization needs help communicating the good work that you do, stop by their website at goodmarketing.com. That is good, G-U-D, marketing.com. So you talk about all of the assessment, right? It's TriTerra, we're deployed to go do the due diligence and these phase ones and phase twos if necessary. So you report back and say, here's what we found or didn't find. When you do find that there is a problem, does TriTerra also do the remediation work yourselves, or are you a reporting agency and then those people have to go find, I get a housing inspection, they're like, this plumbing needs to be updated, this electrical needs to be updated, and then I have to, as the house, if I'm going to buy this house, I got to find a plumber and find an electrician. Do you provide those services yourself, or do you provide mostly just the reporting back?
No, and it depends on, what the need is. So yeah, sometimes there's a case where we got to excavate a tank in some soils. Yeah, we certainly can coordinate that. We don't certainly have excavators.
Okay.
We get those, and we do the oversight and the report writing, because even though we're moving that stuff, typically you're going to want, a trail of evidence that it was done correctly. So there's still report writing associated with that. But yeah, I would say we've got our hands on a lot of things. I mentioned our vapor mitigation group.
Yep.
So again, if we have the potential for vapors to be impacting that, the indoor air and people's ability to, breathe, so to speak, yeah, we do all those installs ourselves. But in most cases, kind of going back to when I was talking about when we assess the exposure pathways, a lot of times we can get away with doing nothing. And by what I mean by that is maintaining pavement. So if we have a direct contact concern, we're just going to maintain the pavement that's over this contamination. You're going to have to do some operations and maintenance, like a program where you go out and inspect it here and there, just confirm that, maybe something hasn't burrowed into the side of a hill and exposing those soils, or whatever the case may be. The vapor mitigation is certainly part of that inhalation concern. So yeah, we can mitigate it that way. And then, like I said, with drinking water, maybe we have to dig a deeper well. Maybe we have to connect to municipal water. I mean, there are options out there. I want people to realize that just because something's contaminated, and to kind of rebut on what you're saying earlier, we can get to the finish line. It's just a matter of how much money and time it's going to take.
But, we're at this kind of confluence as the state of Michigan, surrounded by all this fresh water, which is becoming more and more covetable. And we're such an agricultural state as well. But we also have a very deep history in manufacturing, right? So it seems like, and we need housing. And as the multifamily housing guy, at TriTerra, more than anyone how much energy, we're putting in. So you've got all of these things kind of at play, don't we? Where we've got, aging factories or factories that are that have shuttered that now are prime, second use maybe for some of this multifamily housing. But I'm proud that we've got, as a state, so much pride in cleanliness. Right. I mean, as far as, we actually, I've personally experienced big companies being angry about the high standards that the state of Michigan has in the quality of our land and our water, and that we it's like, I go to other states and they just kind of rubber stamp these types of things, and this state's going to make me spend all this extra money to do these things to protect the environment, but that's a good thing, right?
Sure.
So it's just a fascinating, we really want this built. So I'm glad that you mentioned MSHDA and HUD and NEPA, and it just seems like there's a lot of energy being put into lubricating the square peg round hole type of setup where we need this housing. So we're going to kind of come and give you support and guidance and maybe even funding to help you get to the finish line for a need that we have, which is more multifamily housing.
Well, and that's it. I mean, it's a major dilemma right now. We have a need for 192,000 units of housing right now in Michigan. We have some difficulties, as everyone's aware of, with, the cost to borrow. Home values have just skyrocketed over the last decade. Labor, material costs for the building side. So, so it's great. MSHDA especially, because I work so closely with them. I mean, they are continuously creating new programs, looking at different ways, to bring something to the table to help offset some of those costs because they see the value in the need for that housing.
Right. And, and there's a ton of energy being put into trying to have Michigan be an impound population growth state, right? So you talk about the 192,000 or whatever the number was you threw out of housing needs we have now. You've got the MEDC, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. You got the Pure Michigan campaign, which is a little bit more on the tourism side. We're recruiting companies to come here, and establish here in Michigan. It's like, okay, well, this battery plant's going to employ 3,000 people, So, how do we get people to move to Michigan for these great jobs and the quality of life and the cost of living things? You mentioned that prices are high, but comparatively, we're in a pretty good place to be. So my point is that housing is only going to get worse if we're successful in trying to bring people to the state. So we need to be at the top of our game to grow with it. Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. It's interesting because I just conversed with a client that really brought his whole business to Michigan from the Seattle area. And he was very shocked and surprised with, just how business friendly our climate is, both, at the local level to the state level, the incentives and things like that. He's like, there's nothing like that where I came from. So, it's a pat on the back to the state and multiple levels of government that they're doing their best. I mean, we were Rust Belt state, environmental law in Michigan wasn't even promulgated until 1994. And the reason was we have all of these abandoned buildings and stuff, and nobody wanted to go near them because they knew that there could potentially be held liable for that contamination. So, even Eagle, formerly DEQ, they've done a lot to protect, put policies and procedures in place to protect, new owners of property so we can develop, new places and walkable places and things like that.
Right. Well, good for you. I mean, TriTerra, sounds like you guys are a great partner for people trying to solve this problem and develop the land and doing the work that you're doing. How can people learn more about TriTerra and all the services that you offer?
Yeah, I would say reach out through the website, TriTerra.us. We also can be found on LinkedIn, Facebook, and I apologize, marketing people, I'm missing anything else. But yeah, we're out there, and we look forward to helping anybody in need.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you for the work that you're doing. We know we have a housing need, and you helping developers and landowners kind of get to the finish line is a big part of that. So we've been speaking with the Director of Multifamily Housing for TriTerra, Mr. Shawn Shadley. Thank you very much for joining me here today.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Chris.
Yep. And I'd love to give a final shout out to my loyal sponsors, the Forsberg Real Estate Company, Wagoner Financial, TriTerra Environmental, Good Marketing, Keller Williams Advantage and Team, Michigan Rise, and the attorneys at Foster Swift. These are all fantastic people worth the call. And then if you're finding the show as a one-off, I want to remind you to follow and subscribe to Michigan Reimagined on YouTube, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, pretty much anywhere you find your podcasts. This is Chris Buck signing off for Michigan Reimagined.